name is Igor Degen. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Climate Farmers and your host for today. This is the second edition of the Soil Carbon Removal Think Tank. This is a series that we are running on the intersection of two very interesting and very complex topics, one being international coordination for the protection of climate and for the reduction of CO2 emissions, and the other one, farming with the dynamics and principles of nature. So for all of us that are working within these two spheres, it's not news that each one by itself is very complex, is very complicated, but where they meet, obviously we have a whole jungle. So the intention of this event series is to see where can we find the clarity that already is there, and find out what can we agree on in the space of carbon markets and regenerative agriculture, and where do we potentially still have open questions that need to be discussed further in separate events. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. For now, before we go into the discussion, there's just a bit of housekeeping to be done. So, as I said before, today's event is being recorded. The recording of the event will be uploaded to YouTube tomorrow, so you will have access to it, and it will be sent to you all via email at the beginning of next week. Everybody's microphones are off. You are welcome to participate in the conversation by chat throughout. We will start off with a series of questions to our wonderful panel here, and then give space to your questions for the last 15 minutes. My dear colleague Esther will make a selection from the questions asked in the chat. Of course, we ask all participants for respectful tone in the chat throughout, which I'm sure goes without saying. Something important that we want to address is that this is a full man panel, which is something that we are very much aware of. We always aim for balance and representation in our speakers. This time it hasn't worked out. We are working on improving that throughout. We will also create a blog post on the key learnings from the event and share it on our LinkedIn. Make sure to follow us there. And of course, if you want to explore carbon credits from regenerative agriculture yourself, for your company, you can reach out to us through our website, but more on that later. Before now we get into more details, I would like to introduce our outstanding panel today. Marianne is the founder and co-lead of Carbon Removal Clim Accelerator and Decarbonization Lead at the Sustainability in Business Lab at ETH Zurich. Marianne is an outstanding expert in the spaces of managing carbon removal projects in sectors that are difficult to decarbonize, also in supporting startups in the field of negative emissions. And Marianne, I know from experience being a participant in the Clim Accelerator he's running himself, has incredible knowledge in the realm of CDR, so very glad to have you here. Stefan Jirka, Senior Manager in Agricultural Innovation at Veras. Prior to his role, Stefan was a Senior Associate promoting agricultural development at One Acre Fund, a research specialist at Cornell University, and a program officer at the International Biochar Initiative. Then Kim van der Loof, I hope I'm pronouncing that semi-correctly, lead product vision and carbon market expert at Rabobank, with 17 years of experience in carbon markets, payments for ecosystem services, and impact-driven entrepreneurship. Kim is now driving the transition to regenerative agriculture at Rabobank. So incredible speakers with us today. We are very honored to have you here with us and really looking forward to the conversation. Before we get into this, I would like to give a bit of framing to kick us off, and then we're going to start with the panel. So, as I am sure so many of us here are aware, agriculture is basically the foundation for everything we do in our society. Agriculture is a central player to each of the planetary boundaries which have already been crossed, and therefore goes much beyond even just the climate space. there are different models and different interpretations of this, but we do know that soil is one of the biggest carbon sinks in the world. And we have incredible potential of storing carbon through agricultural practices. So much, in fact, that many projections say that if we were to scale regenerative practices to the extent possible, we could, of course, always together with drastically reduced emissions, reverse the growing trend of CO2 and actually reach what we need, that is drawdown, pulling down more carbon than we are emitting currently. But, or maybe rather, what we are doing goes beyond that. The agriculture sector is before a fundamental shift that we're seeing right now. We are all aware that irregular and extreme weather is more and more usual now. We see more and more either extreme rain events or more severe and prolonged drought. We see more and more difficulty for farmers to plan their harvest, their seeding, their agricultural work because of the changing weathers. But it is not only the climate effects, it's also the economic and political changes that we are experiencing. Right now, it's extremely visible. Russia is one of the biggest fertilizer exporters, given that right now this has stopped. We are witnessing a massive lack of access to fertilizer in Europe, and that will cause problems very soon. So the dependence that we have on external inputs, and not only in sort of on fertilizers and on synthetically based fertilizers, but also on synthetically based pesticides, because those are also going to be more and more regulated over time. So what we are seeing is that agriculture very quickly has to shift from the resource intensive model where it is right now to a more resilient and independent one. And regenerative agriculture is one of the most promising paths towards this. There's a lot of discussion about whether we can feed the world through regenerative agriculture. And what we are seeing is that through regenerative approaches, we get a good average. We do not get the peak performance agriculture that we have seen in the last decades, but we have to be aware that these times are over in any case, given the changes that I've just described. So basically, the potential we have through regenerative agriculture is to stabilize the yields, capture carbon, build biodiversity, and have many more positive impacts on our ecosystems. And through that, also stabilize the farm economy. But we are also aware regenerative agriculture misses essential infrastructure for scaling. This is a very new space and is still in its early phases. So what we are doing with climate farmers, or to give an introduction why we are here, is to build the infrastructure for industry and policy to transition to regenerative methods at scale. And one of the spaces in which this is relevant is in the carbon markets. Many of us here are working in the space, so we are all very aware that the carbon markets provide incredible potential and of course need to be used correctly. The potential is that regenerative conversion to regenerative agriculture is an investment, therefore a risk for farmers. And basically we can provide funding through carbon markets, but it needs to be used in the right way in order to actually create a transition to a more resilient system, not to subsidize the existing system that is already on its way out. But as I said before, regenerative agriculture and agriculture goes beyond carbon. We can capture carbon in soil, but the benefits for biodiversity, for soil, for ecosystems, for water, for our society go much beyond that. The trends that the agricultural transition is part of touch basically everything that we are working with in our society. So on the one hand, the risk is huge, the potential is equally big. And we have a tool in the center that we could use in order to fuel that transition. And we all know also it is still Wild West. And so what we want to discuss through the series and today is how do we avoid the risk of abuse of the carbon markets? How do we make sure that the carbon markets are used in the most responsible way possible in order to employ the funding that is there to really transitioning the agricultural space for the long term. And from now on, we are moving towards our panel. And I would like to start with a relatively high-level question to Marianne. Read a question: what makes a high-quality carbon credit from nature-based solutions at all? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ivo. Great to be here. First of all, let me just echo what you said around carbon removal not being a substitute for carbon reduction. I just want to make this point again and again, because it is important that we need both. And I really like to stick to Swiss Re's motto here: do our best, remove the rest. And I think that's what we all should keep in mind. But that just serves as a primer to what I'm going to say now. When I think about high quality carbon credits from NBS, there are a few parameters that come to mind. Some of them sort of are more easily graspable. Some, especially in the NBS context, pose some more tricky questions or challenges, I would say. Let's start maybe with the little bit easier ones. So a carbon credit needs to be verifiable. So CDR, carbon removal, needs to actually have happened, and this needs to be able to be shown. So that means it needs to be quantified either through, for instance, soil sampling or other ways of estimating or measuring the carbon being taken out of the atmosphere and stored permanently. Along with that goes the second parameter, which is meant to say a carbon removal credit, high quality one, needs to be net negative. So it needs to account from a life cycle perspective for all emissions that have gone into creating this carbon removal credit. So everything, all emissions, be it energy related or be it other inputs that have gone into the production of this carbon removal to the removal of this 1 ton of atmospheric CO2. Those need to be accounted for. And at the end, there is a net value of carbon removal. Then there's two other ones that I'll only touch on briefly. One is that there is no carbon leakage, meaning that because you're removing 1 ton here doesn't mean that that ton is emitted or not removed at a different point. So for instance, talking about regenerative agriculture, just because one farmer adapts regenerative practices and thus removes carbon from the atmosphere, that should not lead to him or another farmer doing causing the emission of a ton at a different place. That would be carbon leakage. And then high quality carbon removal credits also account for and are very cognizant about benefits and risks that come associated with that credit. There are, of course, a lot of co-benefits that come with nature-based solution credits. There might be some risk depending on how you realize those credits. And I'm sure we'll talk about them later on in a bit. And now let's come to the two more tricky bits. And those typically are also the ones that, regardless of whether we talk NBS or other solutions, are ones that, you know, buyers need to be very cognizant about. One is additionality, basically meaning that the climate benefit of that carbon removal would not have happened without the financing through the carbon credit. And to a degree, I mean, you could argue that regenerative agriculture or nature-based solutions are sort of a victim of their own greatness to a sense here, because they carry so many other great benefits that could lead someone to adopt the practices without the carbon credit. So you need to credibly show that there were barriers in place that would have kept you, a farmer or someone in forestry, from adopting the practices that led to the carbon removal. Right? So that is additionality. And then the other one is permanence. Because the effect of CO2 in the atmosphere lasts for several hundreds of years, we also need to make sure that the CO2 we take out of the atmosphere is kept out of it for an extended period of time. And in the nature of nature-based solutions, there is some risk of reversal. So you could also talk about durability, because that accounts for this risk of reversal. And here, there of course are some questions when it comes to permanence. For instance, in regenerative agriculture, when a farmer decides not to prolong his practices, or when a forest burns, right? So those are issues that also solutions exist for, and I think there are other experts to speak more about these solutions. But on a high level, I think if one is looking for high quality carbon removal from nature-based solutions, those would be the parameters that I would keep a close eye on to be addressed in whatever carbon removal is issued.
Wonderful. This is, I think, a great sort of first overview of all the important elements. And I think something that so often is not regarded and not communicated transparently. Stefan, you are working with Vera, and Vera is obviously one of the leading standards in this space. And I'm curious, especially on the last two, on the question of additionality and durability or permanence. How does Vera approach these topics?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Ivo, and Marianne, thanks for the opportunity here. Yeah, definitely. These are tricky issues, and as Marianne was saying, I think really important ones that need to be taken into account for any high quality carbon credit issued in the regenerative ag or NBS space. You know, for additionality, there are some established procedures, right, to determine if carbon finance indeed did drive forward the activity. And some of those include a common practice assessment. So doing a scan of what is the current penetration of a practice or set of practices that is to be adopted in a project. And if there's high penetration, that could be indicative of, you know, the activity already on its own is viable. So that's a good way to kind of check, and is usually a core element of additionality. Then there are barrier analyses that can be done. I think Marianne also mentioned this. Certainly financial barriers, right? Investment barriers that might be needed to adopt the technology, purchase equipment, purchase inputs. These can be all barriers to uptake that are you know, worth taking a look at. But there's also other kinds of barriers, socioeconomic barriers, right? The farming sector has you know, established procedures. The way things have done are often passed down from generation to generation, and change in certain areas can be hard to bring forward. And so taking a look at some of those socioeconomic barriers is very important, and is also an established practice for additionality assessment. And then there's some other approaches on additionality that I can mention, some sort of newer emerging approaches, for example, a performance benchmark, where you would look at the distribution of performance around a metric like soil organic carbon stock change, and then set a threshold for crediting and or additionality. So, you know, the project would have to exceed that threshold to be determined additional. And you know, there are advantages to kind of this performance benchmark approach, but they are very data intensive, right, to understand that, you know, and that distribution to set the metric. Yeah, that's what I'll say on additionality. On permanence, absolutely very important to look at non-permanence risk. So at Vera, we have what we call a non-permanence risk tool to be used at the outset of a project development effort. And that tool results in a risk score, which then determines allocation of a certain amount of credits into a pooled buffer account. This is essentially kind of a pooled insurance against future loss, so that if a reversal does occur, if a farmer does till, let's say, or drop out of a project, then those buffer credits can be canceled to compensate for that loss. So that's an important mechanism that the VCS program kind of pioneered. We are also looking at some long-term monitoring systems to remotely detect real-time reversals across nature-based solution projects in the post-crediting period. So at present, as I mentioned, buffer credits could be canceled at the end of the crediting period to compensate for potential future loss. But with this long-term remote monitoring system, the idea would be to Vera to monitor all projects in our portfolio and to remotely identify any reversals, and only then release credits if there was indeed a reversal that occurred. So there's some benefits to that approach. Yeah, I think that's, I'll stop there.
No, I think this is absolutely great to hear. Just to understand that on the one hand, it is a complicated topic to approach, so you need to do it well. But there are ways of solving this, and I think one of the points that we are coming back to again and again in this series is the importance of following sort of the best practices that organizations such as VCS, such as Vera, are setting out there. And I think this is also something really important for off-takers to be aware of, sort of to pay attention to, is a proper methodology followed, and can sort of the creators of the certificate show how the certificate is created exactly. There were a couple of questions already in the chat that I think we can address with sort of our next question, on the question of how is it actually quantified? How do we actually measure carbon? Because this is a very complicated issue. How do we measure soil carbon? And often for people who are new to the space, it seems straightforward, and the deeper you go into it, the less clear it becomes. And so we have different approaches to this, right? Like we have on the one hand the possibility of measuring, and on the other hand the possibility of modeling or calculating the effect that what we do have. And what I would like to get into is, where does the technology behind actually sort of quantifying soil carbon currently stand, and where is it headed? Because it might be that right now we are not quite there yet, but in the future there is more potential. So I'm curious, Kim, where do you stand with that? How has Rabobank found the readiness of measurement technology in developing carbon credits?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm going to answer that in a second. I just wanted to make one point to the last question, actually. So Stefan and Marianne, thanks for your answers. I think you painted a really good picture of what quality stands for in carbon credits. The Rabo Carbon Bank, we're trying to develop these high quality nature-based credits for our farmer base and of course our corporate off-takers. But I think one point that I really want to make is that yes, additionality and permanence are key to anything related to high quality. However, it is, I think, really important to understand as well what the implications are on the ground for farmers actually wanting to change practices. For instance, I think any scheme should really look carefully at punishing front runners instead of rewarding them when it comes to additionality. Should we exclude people who have already been experimenting with regenerative agriculture from entering programs? Because of course additionality criteria are important, but if we look at a portfolio level, would we actually not need front runners as ambassadors to create the examples that things can work? And I think this is where the balance really lies. Same on permanence. I really, Stefan, on the risk tool, that's a great tool to have. What we see also in the market is a lot of programs actually expect very long contracts to cover some of the risk of default on this. But can you actually expect decade-long contracts from farmers who are dealing with seasonality, with that want inherent flexibility? Now, I think that's where the balance lies, and it's up to all of us there to try and solve those issues. But let's go to measurement.
Sorry, but I think this is a super interesting question. Actually, I'm curious because obviously, sort of this question of how do we not punish the pioneers, right, that have already built up a good level of carbon over the last decade, is there. And so I'm curious from what you just said, what ways have you found of doing that in a way that sort of still complies with the additionality principle?
Well, I bring up that I bring this point because we're struggling with it. I mean, we're at Rabobank, we're pretty proud of our portfolio of rural clients because they score pretty high on traditional sustainability benchmarks. But that also means that our clients are actually often front runners in this aspect. So we are really looking at ways how we can help further incentivize further improvement of their practices and not exclude them from entry into programs. And I think for me, that is a key for any real skill to the future. And it's something that actually the participants here are that could work together on potentially, like how can you create an additionality assessment that not just looks just at the single farmer, but for instance with performance benchmarks, Stefan, would actually include some farmers who have been doing something, but take them into account in the full portfolio and look at it in that way. So if you as a full portfolio cross a certain threshold, it's okay. And that those kind of approaches and innovative approaches is what we need, I think. So unfortunately, we haven't solved it yet. We're in the process, but I think we're trying to do that together here. And I'm definitely going to send some emails to Stefan on this afterwards.
Yeah, I can add a couple of thoughts there. Thanks, Kim. Yeah, agree that the issue of early adopters is very important and one we talk about extensively with stakeholders and internally. I think from an offsetting perspective, it's a tricky one to address because really the integrity of the claim needs to be based on the activity being additional, right? New, something that drew down atmospheric carbon dioxide or reduced emissions. And so that becomes, kind of challenging to address. I think some of the standardized approaches that I mentioned, and you just reiterated, performance benchmark, there are other kinds of activity-based approaches that could potentially be used. I think a lot of them are data intensive to establish those metrics. But I would also add perhaps that the growth of the insetting scope 3 space represents an opportunity here because the additionality requirements need not be so stringent, right? And this is a new space, but expected to grow quickly given all the corporate net zero commitments and the importance of science-based targets initiative, et cetera. So that's another area to look at and something where we are approaching at Vera as well.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. And I agree. I think it is key that you look at it. What we're trying to establish is actually ways to incentivize further optimization or actually further improvement over and above what's already been done. But that means looking at it in a slightly more lenient way, so to speak. And of course, the scope 3 offsetting supply chain decarbonization is also really part of what we're looking at. But it also maybe relates in somewhat to your question, Ivo, that we were actually going to answer, which is around the measurement technology. So we're actually working on a few really exciting angles. We've just almost, the final meeting is this week, concluded a proof of concept on carbon stock measurement with 11 innovative frontrunners in the space, in which we, basically there were two major kinds of technology that we looked at. One is remote sensing combined with machine learning models. The other one is more on in-field measurements. And what we've done is we've compared the results from these approaches and providers with a very extensive ground truthing sampling campaign in order to assess how much they differ from each other. And we were actually really positively surprised by the results, actually, specifically on the remote sensing plus machine learning, where some of the providers were within a 10% average error towards the stock that we measured on the ground, which is highly promising. why we're so interested in these measurement-based approaches is actually because it also takes into account non-modeled results of interventions on the ground. One of the major reasons I think there are some barriers right now is that the way to assess the carbon sequestration results in the soil, they're heavily based on biochemical process-based models, and they heavily rely on practice data. So historical data at a field level, and depending on the models you use, we're talking about seeding dates and harvest dates for every field of a farmer for X years back. Now, that also means that you can only model the results of the practices that you've put in the model. So if a farmer uses a combination of methods and practices, you don't actually capture that holistic result, right? By measuring, you do that. So that's why we're so interested in that. We're seeing very promising results. However, at present under VM42, they aren't accepted yet. And I know, Stefan, there's a revision coming. There's a lot of work being done in this space. So we're highly enthusiastic about this. Personally, I see that the future might be in a combination of all of the above. So ground truthing with some measurements, maybe lab measurements, remote sensing and machine learning, plus some modeling to create a way of assessing that over time. That's how we're looking at it now. We're trying to scale up these pilots to see whether we can bring that into a verified standard.
Thank you. This is fascinating to hear as well, because I think this would have been exactly one of my questions on obviously satellites show great promise, and in the last years there was still an open question about the accuracy of it. So this is very promising. I'm curious, Stefan, do you have thoughts on this sort of looking at the fact that it isn't part of it yet, the revision that is coming? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I do think sensing or remote sensing, as well as proximal sensing, I would add, are opportunities that are on the horizon, if not shovel ready, for use in these kinds of projects. And there's a few different applications. I think, as Kim mentioned, the models are complex. They have high data input needs, but remote sensing can help with that. For example, activity data, remotely monitoring things like cover cropping, planting dates, tillage events, right? That reduces reliance on farmers to provide that data. So we think that is already pretty much ready for use in these projects, and the rigor is there. Speaking specifically about other kinds of sensors, right? Spectroscopy, whether done in the laboratory or via in-field, handheld sensors. This is also well tested. Lots of science that demonstrates the relationship between the spectral signature and more traditionally measured, laboratory measured results. So this, I think, is also ready for use. Remote sensing of actual SOC stock change, very interesting, very exciting. We are also looking at this in discussions with some of these technology service providers that think they can do this, and are very interested in supporting these opportunities, always with the grounding in science and robust kind of review of the results, and the ability to, for example, quantify uncertainties at sufficient spatial resolution. So yeah, definitely something to monitor. One other sort of set of technologies I'll mention is around the use of remote sensing, again, to support with the assessment of variability at the project level, right? And within fields, there's a huge amount of in-field heterogeneity of soil properties. This is really important to understand when designing sampling schemes, if direct measurement will still be done, and in the near term that for many projects will still be a reality. and to statistically and robustly design sampling plans that include stratification that can really help reduce uncertainties and bring down the costs. So this is another area of growth where I think there are technology service providers that have an interesting commercial offering.
Wow, yeah, promising. Great to hear. I think there's a lot going on there. I completely agree with all of your points, and I think Kim made an interesting point that right now a lot of what we consider regenerative practices, or a lot of sort of the carbon inputs from regenerative agriculture aren't fully included yet, and this is another area of development that with climate farmers we are also working on. So lots of developments going on in the space, and I think in the next 1 or 2 years we're going to see huge changes. I would like, looking at time, would like to jump to one point that I think is very, very central to our discussion here, and that is the one of co-benefits, which right now are called co-benefits, which is really sort of water, biodiversity, which are sort of the many side effects, so to say, that we have through implemented carbon projects. And I'm curious to hear from Marianne, first of all, maybe. What are the sort of, how do you see co-benefits? Is that a nice to have for a certificate, or is that sort of more of a real value add to a certificate?
Yeah, great question. I'd start by sort of asking the question, why would anyone, be it an individual or corporate, buy a credit in the first place, right? We often assume that is only for offsetting purposes, but there is a different side to this, which is if one bought a carbon credit, a carbon removal credit, to make not a compensation claim, to compensate for an emission that I emit, but rather to contribute to climate action. I think this is specifically where NBS really excels with a lot of the co-benefits that they have. And also in this case, the permanence additionality do not matter to the same degree that they mattered if I wanted to make a compensation claim with it. That being said, companies, still do buy offsets or do buy carbon credits to offset emissions, so to make a compensation claim. And in that case, I think the co-benefits are not necessarily only a nice add-on, but they can be the prime reason why a company would decide to procure an NBS credit vis-a-vis a more technology-based credit, for instance, from direct air capture. Because there is some alignment with the business activities of that company. For instance, if, say, a company out of the food supply chain, they may want to buy an NBS credit because this way they can actively sort of regenerate the resource that they depend on to a large degree. And we've seen it also in the market that companies that do have some stake in an NBS field with their business activity, be it geographical proximity, be it because it's part of their supply chain, they tend to be a lot more open towards procuring NBS credits rather than the more technological focused engineered companies, I would say. Also because it's a nice way to tell a story around regeneration of the resource that you're depending on. I think looking forward, in an ideal world, I think for NBS we'd ideally turn primary and secondary benefits around and make co-benefits the primary reason why someone would invest into NBS, and the carbon removal bit sort of a secondary nice add-on, right? We're not there yet because I think we lack the ability and the tangible measurement of, for instance, biodiversity. But once we were able to do that, I think that would be a very, very nice turnaround. And yeah, that's certainly what I hope for.
So another really interesting dynamic to look out for in the probably near future. Kim, how do you see that? Like, do you see a market developing for sort of contributions to ecosystem services by themselves, separate from carbon, or sort of lightly connected to carbon?
Well, first of all, totally. I actually see both happening, and they might happen in parallel. In our experience and in my experience, I think, actually, Marianne, you make a really good point. So why do people buy nature-based credits in general is there's an implicit need already for these co-benefits. You could otherwise just buy the let's say, the cheaper renewable energy credits from the easier projects, if it's just about the ton of carbon is a ton of carbon narrative. So I think there is an implicit valuation of co-benefits, and buyers actually do, so off-takers ask for these co-benefits. I also believe that carbon storage is not the end goal. It's part of the solution. It's just the one that has a liquid market attached to it. So that's why we use it. And that's why because it is quantifiable, because it actually relates to something that we have set targets on, it has a monetary value, and therefore it's very easy to use, but it's not the metric to rule them all. And even though we're called the Rabo Carbon Bank, we're actually interested in farmer resilience and future proofing our client base, and they are as well. It's about the future of food. It's not about just the climate. So that's a long answer to say yes. I do see this happening. I also think that some quantification methodologies and stacking of these benefits within a credit in either adding credit types to something or packaging it would really help. Some are very hard to quantify, and they will probably remain a narrative. You could say it would be a combinations of benefits in one product. You could also say it might mean that some benefits are split. Some people would be interested just in the carbon, other people would be interested in water credits. That remains to be seen, but at least the quantification of these non-carbon benefits, that's where it starts. So I think there is already quite a lot of interest in that and being done. So we definitely support that. It's something our clients actively ask for. It's not something you can actually make liquid right now and monetize, except in the premium that's paid for the credit.
Mm-hmm. I think this is another, I think there's so many of these topics that we're sort of just touching on that, would merit a whole hour of discussion. I'm looking at time and we are already running out of it, which is incredible. But I think this is something that where we're going to see a lot of development over the next period. Wanting to also get to the questions of everybody listening. Maybe last one to Stefan, if you want to sort of quickly touch on whether this is something that Vera is also looking at, sort of the moving beyond only carbon, and maybe a word of advice. What would you tell off-takers? What would you tell buyers to focus on when or what to pay attention to when looking at nature-based solution credits?
Yeah, thanks, Ivo. So 100% agree with Marianne and Kim that co-benefits are very important, and perhaps the primary benefits when we take the long view of climate resilience, productivity, soil health, the multiple sort of crises we're facing. We definitely hear lots of interest from market participants on these co-benefits, and we have a couple of established and emerging frameworks already to quantify and kind of stack these credits, as Kim was just sharing. So one example is the Climate Community Biodiversity Standard, CCB standard, which is already often used in conjunction with more well-established project types such as RED Plus. So we know that CCB plus VCUs, stacked together get a premium on the market, and we do expect that the CCB could be used in conjunction with regenerative ag projects. I think we actually just have a recent submission of a regen ag projects into the VCS that does exactly this. We also have the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, SD-VISTA, which is a framework to measure progress towards the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and lots of interest there. And I think the opportunity to use this SD-VISTA program, it's in a similar sort of stacking approach with projects that want to focus and highlight the SDGs. So yeah, I think looking at to your last question there, advice, looking at the types of activities that are included in a project, and what the baseline condition was. I think in general, regenerative ag projects, we can be pretty certain, just based on the kind of transition of practices that are implemented, will deliver co-benefits in the near term already around some of these critical issues like biodiversity, like water quality, soil health, even socioeconomic benefits.
Thank you. Great input, and I think I would love to discuss further afterwards. So I hope we get the opportunity. I would like to hand it over to Esther, who has made a selection of the questions from the chat, I believe. Do you have a question from the audience for us, Esther?
I do. The chat has been super lively, so I'm afraid we'll not be able to answer all of them, but I've chosen a couple of ones that we can talk about. So the first question is from Gustavo, and this is touching again upon permanence and additionality. Gustavo says, in the past, the world has observed a lot of hot air, even on official systems like the Clean Development Mechanism. Could you clarify in specific terms, what are the means to ensure effective additionality and permanence?
Stefan, would you like to go? Yeah, I mean, this is, to do it in a brief time, a challenging question to address, but I'll attempt to here. So, I think the key with additionality in an offsetting context is that the activity would not have happened in the absence of carbon finance. And this is because if a company then, an off-taker, is using the carbon credit generated from the project to offset, residual emissions, the community wants to be sure that that project would not have happened, i.e. is additional to the baseline scenario. So the procedures to determine this, I think get a little tricky, and I talked about common practice, different barrier analyses, financial barriers, socioeconomic barriers, and then some of these other approaches around performance benchmarks and understanding the distribution of performance. So yeah, probably we could talk offline more about the specifics of additionality and different ways that the programs and methodologies look at this. For permanence, yeah, it's the question relates to having some assurances that the practices that were implemented as part of a project have durability, are going to over what is usually a 100-year time frame, as established by the IPCC, kind of be locked in for that amount of time, right? To ensure that there's not a reversal, that those soil carbon stocks or that forest biomass is not re-released into the atmosphere and we lose that benefit. And so then permanence, and there are different ways that programs ensure permanence. Some do require 100-year contracts. That's not the case in the VCS. There are other approaches by using this, in our case, this pooled buffer account to release credits where there is a reversal event. But in the future, long-term monitoring systems to remotely detect reversal events, and even insurance is something we're scoping. These are different kinds of products that can be used to monitor and ensure permanence and compensate for losses, which will happen in some cases.
I think what I would just like to add to that as well is in nature-based solutions, it's basically impossible to have permanent if you do not have inclusion of the stakeholder. I mean, it's generally very difficult to have permanence guaranteed in any way. But the only way that we're going to get anywhere close to it is if the human stakeholder has a real interest in maintaining that carbon where it is, right? So trees are always going to be chopped off when the human stakeholders do not have an interest in them staying there. And so I think the important thing with regenerative agriculture is that we're not only looking at, well, implement this for the carbon credit, but implement it because you want to implement regenerative agriculture over the long term, because it makes more sense for you, for resilience for your farm, and therefore you also get financing for it. And I think this is a very important distinction that is often not made, that the carbon market is a wonderful transition tool, but it is not a good subsidy for a system that isn't working per se. And I think this makes a big difference. But looking at time, let's see if we have another question that we can address.
Yes, looking at time and also giving everybody the chance to answer this, Nisha had a very interesting question. She asked, if the speakers had a magic wand, what is the one thing that would make your work easier?
Who would like to start?
Marianne, you unmuted first, so go
Yeah,
ahead.
maybe I can give it on a high level, because I mean, what we're doing is supporting a lot of regenerative ag projects, startups, as well as enabling solutions like MRV. And I think what would help the complete space and the startups themselves is clarity and agreement on one common standard that they then can work on and work towards. The lack of clarity, and Ivo called it Wild West, and indeed it is Wild West, is making it very tough for early companies to find a fit in this nascent market. And maybe that the CRCM provided by the EU will provide this. I would hope so. I am not sure whether it will, but my magic wand would certainly go towards that. Kim, maybe you can go next if you would.
Yeah, I think it's very much where I would go as well. I think the term Wild West, it's often when new market is there, people are looking for new avenues. And I think that maybe the biggest risk in the market is the market itself, in the sense that I think anything that has to do with creating positive impact has an additional standard to adhere to. Like, if things go wrong, right, the reputational risk is even higher, because you've done it with the intention to do something positive. And I think there, clarity on standards, clarity on how do we actually measure this. So standardizing the standards would really help. It would really help stakeholders navigate this nascent market, because as growers and farmers and cooperatives, it's not their world. They rely on us all to guide them towards the best fit. So having clarity on those standards, having clarity on what actually constitutes an accurate enough measurement would really help. So I think you summarized all the points. For me, it would, if the magic wand would be, I have the one approach to rule them all. We know exactly what to do, which farmers to go into conversations with, because we can tell them, well, if you do A, we can finance you with B, and the result would be C. That would be the magic wand. We're not there yet. We're trying to create it, but I love the question, by the way. So thanks.
Thank you. Stefan, what about you? What would you say?
Yeah, no, I think I'll piggyback on those comments. I mean, I'm tempted to talk about technology solutions and such, and I think it's hard to put my finger on one single solution that could really unlock the space. So, and at the same time, I agree that having some common principles is very important and will help with some of the confusion that is in the market, particularly in the ag sector, given the emergence of many different programs and initiatives. I can share, and many of you are probably aware of the work of the Integrity Initiative for Voluntary Carbon Markets. They, I think now in Q3, are planning to release some what they call core carbon principles, which will, at least in part, get to some of this, right? And the idea being that these principles then provide some overarching market rules for quality for credibility. And so, you know, Vera certainly is keeping our eyes in that process and even participating in that process.
Wonderful. I think we all very much share these magic wand ideas, and this is exactly the idea of the series of events that we wanted to do with climate farmers, to sort of get to this common agreement across the space. What do we all care about? What is sort of the quality standard that we all want to reach, and sort of understanding, you know, what do we already understand, so we can apply it and make use of this space in a responsible way. So this is exactly something that we are working on. One of the outcomes of this series of conversations is going to be sort of a position paper, and we invite everybody to participate in this. We're going to receive more information on that over the next time, and we're very much looking forward to continuing the conversation. We're going to have one of these conversations every month, so there's loads more space to explore this topic. Thank you all. Have a great day, have a great evening, have a great morning, wherever you are. Really looking forward to the next conversation. Thank you.